Well, that's us, folks. Welcome to Future Work in Scotland this evening. Wherever you're up to be, morning or afternoon, welcome all. If this is your first time, very warm welcome to you. If you've been with us before, I recognise many faces and names. Warm welcome back. It's just me, myself, this evening. I think I mentioned that to a few of you as you joined the call. So I'm going to attempt to be myself, Babs, and Donald. Babs is away on business in Serbia, of all places. Fabulous. Lucky her, and Donald's on a course. So, yeah, I'm going to go through the usual formalities. In terms of code of conduct, just the usual, most of you are familiar with it. We ask in short that you just be respectful to one another. We want everyone to have a great time. We'll do the usual community shout outs at the end. And yeah, this is our second session of the month, our second last of the year. And I am delighted that Professor Donald Clark is joining us. I'm especially delighted because he recently was kind enough to join us in an internal conference we ran in my organisation. I'm in the bank, and unfortunately I couldn't join his session because I was talking at the same time. so I missed that. So I'm really chuffed tonight. Donald's got an amazing background, as you probably saw in his bio and Meetup. He's been in the industry 30 years. He's the CEO of Wildfire, who are an AI-driven learning company. And that's really why we're here tonight. He's done a whole host of other things. He's the board member of, is it Knowledge Pool? Learning Pool. And I was astonished to see the number of places he's actually lectured, including none other than Stanford and Harvard. Well, there you go, folks. So no, delighted he's here. Welcome, Donald, and really looking forward to your session. Just to say there'll be no slides tonight, folks. So yeah, you get the opportunity to tune in and listen to Donald's insights. Donald, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me start by saying that it's quite nice to hear a lot of Scottish voices because you can tell I'm Scottish, but I haven't lived in Scotland for 35 years, and I'm actually doing this Zoom call from Brighton in the south coast, which is as far away from Scotland as you can get in Britain, I suppose, without getting wet. So it's quite nice. I miss Scotland, actually, to be honest. My kids are English. It's quite odd having kids with another accent, especially during sporting events, but there we go. That's life. And I suppose just to kick this off, I mean, this organization, the Future of Work, is an interesting phrase in itself, because I think in a sense, AI changes everything on that one topic alone, never mind learning. You know, anyone who doesn't think that artificial intelligence continues, and will change the very nature of work is living in a dreamland, really, because the automated process, I suspect, and many political scientists would agree with this, may in fact be a deep root cause for some political unrest, Trump, Brexit, all sorts of things happening. You know, the fact that people are feeling aggrieved about their position in life and the lack of hope for their kids may be in part caused by that. But I do want to talk about something very positive, almost technology for good issue here, because although we talk about AI in relation to finance, business in general, it's very rarely that the good side is talked about, And I have been delivering, the technology and learning business for a long, long time. Started a company, floated it in the stock market, sold it 2005, been involved in all sorts of things. In fact, I invested heavily in an AI company in Scotland called Cog Books, who are based in Codebase. Scotland itself is interesting. It has one of the biggest and most important AI departments in Europe at Edinburgh University. Another interesting thing is that Harriet Watt, and not a lot of people know this, but in my world, in the AI chatbot world, there's a thing called the Alexa Prize. And the team from Harriet Watt are world leading in that area. They almost top and get it first every time they enter for that prize. So Scotland has some real expertise in this area, and some really good companies who are doing it. And I was struck recently when I read the Logan report about the future of work in Scotland that, his recommendations were that you need an ecosystem, and around the AI you certainly do. You need investors. I personally am an angel investor, invested in Cog Books, brought the investment, several million to that company based in Codebase in Edinburgh. But you also need the expertise from the colleges and universities and a viable business community. And it all starts in schools, I think. You know, it all starts with encouraging kids not to just do the predictable thing, but perhaps think about starting a business and getting into that startup type world. You know, Scotland has about 5 billion a GDP in the tech business, about 100,000 jobs, but boy, does it desperately need more, in my opinion. So I think this is apposite in the Scottish context. And of course, there's another context here, which is COVID. Out of the blue, my world, in other words, online learning became, you know, blended learning and all that stuff was actually on the national news all of a sudden. So we're already in a position where clearly we're doing blended working on Zoom, most of us. We do blended entertainment even, you know, we're watching a lot more Netflix than we ever have. Remember, that's mediated by AI. We're doing even blended eating, you know, I don't know about you, but Deliveroo's are regular at my front door, and even blended communication. So I think blended learning, you know, this mixture between perhaps in the future lectures, traditional learning in school, and more online will be certainly the norm on this front. But one thing I want to start with is the fact that you may think that AI is a distant thing from learning or from you personally, but you live in AI. Everybody lives in AI. If you search or do anything online, if you search on Google, it's pure AI. If you search for anything on YouTube, it's pure AI. If you do anything on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, it's not only mediated by AI, lots of those services are actually intimately involved with AI delivery at the front end and tiling and interfaces and so on. TikTok's an interesting one, which is a massive AI-driven platform. But it's not just those things. If, as I've said, you watch Netflix, your tiled screen will be mediated by AI. So the choices you've made on movies were probably influenced by an algorithm. If you buy something on Amazon, it's the choices we know. Amazon has been hugely successful because it uses AI to tile your screen to create that frictionless one-click interface. So almost everything we do now is mediated by AI. Even some of the learning services online. 100 million people are on Duolingo learning 50 languages as we speak. Purely an AI play by Lewis, a Guatemalan programmer out of Carnegie Mellon in the States. And that is a massively AI adaptive learning system. So let's not pretend it's not there, that we don't live in it. Use Google, use YouTube. If you work in a university, you use Google Scholar, you use AI all the time. But let me switch gear now and talk about the topic tonight, and that's AI and learning. It may seem like two odd bedfellows, but whenever I give a talk on this, if you come from an educational background, I always give a big sort of disclaimer or warning about AI here, because it's only maths, it's only software, you know, it doesn't have any consciousness. And a good way of putting this is that it's competent without comprehension. In other words, AI is very, very good at narrow precision things, but it's hopeless at general things. So AI is not as good as a teacher because it doesn't have general skills, but it can be very good at specific things like checking plagiarism, checking your ID through face recognition or whatever. Another thing, another description for AI in the education sphere, which is useful, is to call it an idiot savant. So let me give you an example. I have I'll say Alexa because she's in the room with me, and it would spark her off if I said the name, but you know what I mean, my voice assistant. And I have a little robot that collects dust from my carpets in the lower floors of my house. Now I can spark her off and get her to come through and clean the carpet. And she will, and it's driven by AI. It's a little camera, a little brain almost, and it maps the bottom floor of my house and mathematically will clean it spectacularly, okay? So it's driven by AI, but it's an idiot savant. It will come through and do that, but I also have a dog. Now, if my dog comes in and does its business in the middle of the carpet, my AI-driven smart robot will come and will smear its business mathematically into every corner of the room, because it doesn't know shit, as they would say. It doesn't know anything. It has no brain, it has no consciousness. And that's why I would call it an idiot savant. You know, it's incredibly smart at narrowcast things, but incredibly stupid at the same time, because it doesn't have any of those general adaptive skills. So that's the premise behind using AI in learning, okay? Another thing that we must, I know there's plenty of technical expertise on this call tonight, And no one would deny that the top companies by market cap on the planet are now essentially AI companies. Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, even further down, Tesla is bigger than all the other car companies. And in China, Badai, Tencent, Alibaba. Those, if you ask the CTOs in those companies what their strategies were, AI would be the premise behind the technology. And so AI has become the major, we're living in the age of algorithms. It's the major technology of the age. And to imagine that it won't touch education and training and learning is, is a bit stupid, to be honest, because it touches everything. Fundamentally, AI is the new UI, the new user interface. It's giving us all these. If I did talk to my Alexa in the corner of my room, that's because she recognizes, it's I'm anthropomorphizing already, calling her a she. It will recognize my voice because of AI. So, the speech to text and then text to speech coming back at me, that frictionless interface. And funny sort of way, AI is humanizing the technology. It's bringing it to people who didn't have contact with technology before. And in schools, it's long been a stalwart for increased accessibility for those with learning difficulties, visual impairment and hearing impairment and so on. So it's been around for a long time there. But also in the learning space, there are some interesting people who have come in from left of field. We may think that education, or pedagogy as they call it in the universities, grows by academics and education departments, but it doesn't really. The major pedagogic shifts, and I think there's probably been more pedagogic shift in the last 10 years than the last 1,000 years, has come from people like Page and Brin at Google, who are both AI people by background, Sebastian Thrun, head of AI at Google, who started Udacity, which is now worth over $1 billion. Salman Khan is a maths guy who does a big online maths service, huge global enterprise now. And then Andrew Nigg and Daphne Koehler, who started Coursera, which is also worth about $1.5 billion. None of those people came from an educational background. They came from a highly technical AI background, but they solved a problem, and that problem was scalability. How do we scale education and learning out of the school? I mean, if you're a high school or primary school teacher, you will teach no more than just a few thousand kids in your entire life. If you're a university lecturer, the same thing. These people are getting 160,000 people on a single course. So the scalability is what the technology brings, but it also brings some smartness as well. And that's what I want to touch upon now. And first of all, get the teacher robot out of the way. I give a lot of talks at conferences. I'm really tired of seeing a little robot speaking before me, it either falls over, doesn't say anything meaningful, or is completely and utterly silent. AI is not about robotics in the classroom. It's not about a robot teaching. It's more like Google. It's an online service and so on. But I think I'd like to describe, in fact, let me stop there. That's been I'll give a little pause here because I've given a general characterization of AI, why it's important globally, not only for work, but also in terms of education. Has anybody got any questions?
I've had a few come in, so I'm pleased you've took a pause, so we can maybe answer a few, and then, as you say, you can move on to the next section. So John's asking, would it be right to assume that some level of AI would review research papers, like checking facts, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be a bit careful here because that's one area where you have to be quite sensitive. But let me take the base example there. So Google Scholar, I write books. I've got my artificial intelligence book, and it's full of citations. And I've been writing all day today, and I'm on Google Scholar all the time. And of course, that's pure AI. And Google Scholars are, who could live without it? I remember I did my PhD in Edinburgh, and I spent 6 months of my life wandering up and down shelves looking for journals and books. Honestly, it was that long. It was that long ago, but it took that. I think they should take 6 months off every PhD student's time now, because you can get it in a second on Google Scholar. So AI is integral to the identification of research papers. Now, your question was about the review of those papers. Now, there's an interesting set of technology around sentiment analysis. In other words, you can look at text and see whether people have used, what the emotional content of the text is. That wouldn't occur in academic writing, but it can certainly check whether, let's say, someone who's writing an academic paper for the first time has made some errors. They may be statistical errors, it may be just typos. That sort of thing can certainly be done by text analysis. So I think there are a whole number of areas where it could be done. And of course, AI has become a central agent in research itself. Currently during COVID, there's, AI has been applied on a massive scale in terms of the search for proteins and so on. So there's all sorts of facets to the research side that make AI an indispensable tool now.
So Rhiann's got us started with a kind of nice, interesting question following on from that. So she's asking, why are most robots female? Yeah,
good question. So
that's a great question.
Yeah, there's a very good book on this called Talk to You by a guy called Vlahos. Now, so my ALXEA is a female voice by default, and so is Siri. Now, you might think that this is a patriarchal plot, but believe me, it's not. So in that book, there's a whole chapter on why those voices were launched as female voices. Now they're mostly optional, so you can change them to whatever voice you want. But the research, I remember it was the guy at Microsoft on Cortana who originally said that the base research was that consumers much preferred female voices. And his phrase was by a golden mile. And it was all the research pointed towards a higher frequency, which cuts through the noise, whether you're on the street or in the home, but also the friendliness of the voice. They all have different personalities. The research is really interesting now, but they all came to the same conclusion that a female voice was preferred by people who buy such services. An interesting bit of research behind that as well is that even in the womb, kids respond to a woman's voice in a way they don't to male voices. So the research was quite deep, but I would point you towards that book. If you're really interested in the detail here, that's the reason. But of course, most of those services now are optional. You can choose the voice you wish. Okay. Any other questions there?
I didn't see any others. I think we're probably okay for now, but we'll have plenty of time for them later. Yeah, quite happy for you to.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
To carry on. Yeah.
Excellent questions already.
Yeah, great stuff.
So let me turn to the AI and learning sphere. How could AI help with your kids to learn, or you to learn, or people in universities to learn? And I've already mentioned it's already there. Interesting, when I was in Stanford, we had a room of medical students with faculty in the same room. They hardly ever talk to each other in an informal fashion at universities, as you well know if you teach them one. But when the students were asked what they did, what tools they used for learning, the top two were interesting. These are smart kids, straight A students, medical students at Stanford. The top two tools were Google and YouTube. The faculty nearly fell off their chairs, really, but that was the truth, that they were online all the time. If they had a question, even Wikipedia was massively used by medical students because the medical content of Wikipedia is actually quite good. So the tools that young people are using are very different from the traditional methods that I certainly experienced in both school and university, because it's available on a laptop or through a smartphone. But if we go through the learning journey, and I'll explain stage by stage how AI is now currently being used in education. So you're talking about engaging students. You have to engage learners. They have to be motivated or they don't learn a damn thing. You then have to support them as they go through, okay? You then need content. You need an actual course for them to learn from, or even informal learning. You need content of some kind. And then you need to assess them. So we'll keep it simple at that for the moment. And we'll go through that journey to see how AI actually helps you. Now, on the engagement and support, an interesting thing has been happening around chatbots. Now, chatbots are quite primitive at the moment, but let me give you a really interesting example of how powerful they can be. In Georgia Tech, they had an AI course with 350 students, and they had 9 teaching assistants. And if you've ever taught a technical course, most of it's project-based. You have to get the students to do the coding. You give them projects, they work in teams. But there's a big problem with this, because the students come up, what library in Java or Python should I be using for this for this assignment? You get bombarded with questions. So the department in Georgia Tech built a chatbot to deal with this. They took 40,000 questions. That if you got one member to faculty to answer all of those, it would take 4 solid years. So they canned that data, created a chatbot so that students can ask the questions, and the chatbot came back. And they rather cleverly swapped the chatbot out. So 9 real teaching assistants, real humans, swapped one out for the bot. None of the students spotted it was a bot. One did get a little clue. One sort of got suspicious. Remember, these are AI kids, because it came back so quickly. He went, hold on a minute, that was quick, And what they did is they put a delay in the software so that the bot seemed to be a human being that typed. So they had to actually slow the bot down to fool people into thinking it was human. Anyway, the net result of all this was that the students put it up for a teaching award. Now, that is weird. The fact that a piece of software was put up for a teaching award in one of America's top universities in a technical department. But why? Why was it put up for a teaching award? Well, there were a couple of reasons. One, if you've ever, I don't know how many you did a technical degree, but if you ever emailed a member of faculty with a question about your assignment, I don't know how quickly you got a reply. In my days, they didn't really reply at all because email between students and faculty did not exist. But my son, who has a degree in AI, he estimated it was 3 days minimum before he would get a reply from a member of faculty, sometimes a week, sometimes never, interestingly. Here, the bot gave support, allowing the kids to get on with their learning immediately on the button, as it were. The second important thing is it was consistent. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't like that, what, you didn't know that type thing, which you sometimes get in the miscommunication in that context. So there are several things that justify or explain why the bot was treated with some respect and admired by the students. Other bots have come in that allow you to contact other students if it's your first year at university. Others have been used for recruitment. Others have been used for onboarding when you hit campus, all sorts of uses for chatbots on that front. So that's engagement and support, okay? Another really big, this is also true in corporate training as well. So I'm a board member of a thing called Learning Pool with offices all over the place in America. And all of their big contracts now are delivered on things called learning experience platforms, and they have chatbots in them. So you're sitting in your corporate environment and you go, somebody in the meetings mentioned blockchain or something. You go, what the hell is blockchain? I have no idea what blockchain is. And so what they have is a bit like Google Assistant. It will go and find out what projects you have in the Royal Bank of Scotland on blockchain, because it's sitting with a special form of search, I think called Elasticsearch, and it's searching through not all the stuff within the bank, as it were, intelligently to find out who you might need to speak to if you're interested in blockchain, whether any projects are on the go in the blockchain, or even just what blockchain is, a simple definition, or maybe a TED talk on it, whatever. So even in the corporate environment, these chatbots are coming to the fore. SAP are big on chatbots, the big IT company in Germany. If we move on to another area, so what about all the content, So everybody has rushed to Zoom. Every lecturer and teacher in the land has suddenly become an online teacher. This was a big mistake, by the way, this online lecturing. I'm not a big fan of lecturing, full stop. I think it's a very poor pedagogy. Almost everybody I know who went to university has stories of pains in their chest with boredom at dull lectures. But what they fail to realize is that we've had 30 years of online learning, and actually what people do offline is more importantly. The teacher is good for motivation, getting people started, but it's what the kids do on their own that really matters. So you need good content. And the world is awash with good content now. If you want to know about AI, then most of the good stuff is available from MIT. The best minds in the world are online telling you, whether it's through MOOCs, free online resources, as I say, Duolingo, Khan Academy on maths. Why teachers do not use this stuff is completely and utterly beyond me, but that's sitting there. But supposing you're working in an organization and you have a training problem, you really have to get people up to speed on topic X, Y, or Z. We're now using AI to create that content. In other words, you can literally send me a PowerPoint, a document, or a video. Every organization has this huge motherload of that stuff that nobody ever gets around to reading because it's just too much. So how do you get that knowledge into the heads of your employees? Well, we can use AI now to take that document. It can summarize it using extractive or abstractive AI. So, extractive is extracting all the bad sentences and just squashing it down. That's extractive. Abstractive is précising it, a bit like you did in school, précising an English essay. And then that's more amenable for learning purposes. But AI on a video, for example, can grab the transcript, what was said, the narration. It can then use natural language processing to identify the language points, and then can create the questioning automatically. It can even interpret open answers. So if I asked you a question, such as what's the difference between machine learning and reinforcement learning in AI, you can type a few sentences in, and I can use AI or natural language processing to interpret the answer, semantically interpret your answer, so you get sophisticated, almost Socratic dialogue in the teaching. way beyond multiple choice questions and so on. That's a multimedia type online learning that's more common in big corporates. So AI is smart software doing smart things in terms of the creation of content. But it's not just about the creation of content, which is sometimes a bit limited. It's a bit like wearing a suit that's 2 sizes too small for you. You feel cramped by it. If you want a more expansive view of learning, then AI can also curate content. It can go out onto the web and find the relevant information for you. So we've been using tools that do that as well. In other words, you may want a deep dive into a particular topic like reinforcement learning, and we will get the right stuff to you at the right time within your organization. So curation and content creation are 2 big things. The big one though, and the company I mentioned earlier that's based in Codebase in Edinburgh called Cogbooks, COGBOOKS.com, look at their website. They are perhaps, I would say, the best adaptive learning company on the planet. They've been so successful that the university that they launched all their courses on, I'll explain what adaptive learning is in a moment, actually pumped a big 7-figure sum in and invested in the tech company. This is unknown that a university would do such a thing, but this is smart software. And let me explain what it is, adaptive learning. Imagine you were driving from Edinburgh to Glasgow and you took a wrong turn. Your GPS would get you back on course again. The triangulation of the satellites, some AI, interestingly, gets you back on course. Now, if I've taught kids maths in the past. One of the big problems is that in a subject like maths, it's difficult to teach and difficult to learn. So most people get catastrophic failure. At some point, they'll lose the plot and they never learn any maths thereafter because everything beyond you in maths depended on you knowing this. You're not going to go on and do calculus if you don't have basic algebra. So the way in which adaptive learning copes with this problem of catastrophic failure is it creates all the learning objects, and every learner goes through that set of objects or vectors through the content in their own way at their own pace. And hanging off the side of it is an intelligent tutor, which is keeping an eye on you. Now, that intelligent tutor is aggregating data from all the students that took that course in the past, all the courses you've taken in the past. It knows a thing or two about you. Okay, it aggregates that data and brings it to bear at that very moment when you get stuck, which everybody does. You know, when I had maths homework at school in Scotland, I couldn't ask my dad. He didn't have any maths, you know, he left school at 15. So what happens when people get stuck? Well, this is when adaptive learning really comes into its own, because you get help that's absolutely targeted at you as an individual. So people who are not very good at maths, they're not very good, may take longer to get the concepts. They vector through slowly. People who are really good vector through quickly. It's personalized learning. Now, this company called Books launched this 4 years ago in Arizona State University, delivering 101 courses in physics, stats, biology, even American history. They're now delivering a full degree using adaptive learning, a full degree using adaptive learning. Now, this is with faculty. It's not replacing faculty. It's not doing the whole thing, but boy, is it helping. Okay. Once again, I'll bring a little pause to the proceedings here because I see some questions coming up here. So
yeah, we've got a number of them coming through now.
Yeah.
We've got a few more from Rayam. Yeah, that was Cogbooks. I was just looking at their website while you were talking there, Donald. Please give the Codebooks link again. Oh, is that the book or is that the Cogbooks website?
It's COGBOOKS.com.
Yeah, I just like
or .co.uk, yeah.
Yeah, they've got offices in India and US, it looks like.
That's right. All the development was done as a huge programming team for several years in India. But all the customers are in the US, not a single customer in Scotland or England, interestingly. But I think that's because American universities are way ahead on this. I'm just being honest, it's the truth. China and the US, I mean, basically China and US and AI in general are just leaping ahead of the game with regard to, you know, people doing things in the real world. And I think that's a shame, but that's why I'm on the warpath and being so evangelistic about this stuff.
Well,
we got our finger out.
Just when you said it, is that a bit akin to the past when we were kind of focused on the kind of nuclear war? Is that a similar thing for the digital age?
Well, let's answer that question. So it's a bit of a puzzle, a conundrum. Why is Europe? Europe has got fantastic AI expertise, but we have no massive tech companies either in services or in financial payments. You know, they're all they're from outside Europe. And I think Europe's got itself in a bit of a bind. So politically, all the money and all the intent is about regulating tech. I mean, Europe spends huge sums of money on the ethics of AI. Every man, woman, and a dog now is on an AI and ethics committee. But we can do that if we want, but it's not getting us anywhere, really. If we just see ourselves as the police people of the world on AI, then I think we're going to lose badly on the things that AI are good for. It may even cripple the good research and the good applications I'm talking about, which is why Cogbooks find all their customers in the States. Right. Even GDPR was applied with such force to small companies that you wonder whether it was the right tool. Everybody loves it. It's okay if you're a big company, you can afford to cope with it. Exactly. But if you're running a company on a cash basis, it can be a problem. So, I think there are problems there, in terms of the European intent on that front. Sorry, were there any other questions that came up?
Yeah, there's a couple here. It'd be good to just get through them. It'll make it a little easier at the end as well. So there's another one here from Rayam. It's about, because I know Rayam's kind of, I think, recently graduated and quite keen. I guess it's a good question for yourself. So would you recommend doing a PhD in AI or kind of doing a job with companies? So I guess that's what might be a good path to kind of breaking into the AI industry, I guess, is probably the question. What would you recommend as a professor in this field?
It's an interesting one. So my son has a degree in AI, okay, and he did quite well. In fact, in fact tomorrow he's publishing a paper which is his undergraduate thesis at a conference. So, but boy, he doesn't want to go on and carry on into the either masters or beyond, because he can go straight out and work in AI. To be honest, my preference is always for people who get out and do it in the real world, because AI is a peculiar I say this with a big disclaimer. If you're seriously interested in one strand of AI and you want to follow through in an academic career, PhD, fine. If you really are that focused on one particular topic and you find a PhD topic that you're absolutely passionate about, but just defaulting into a PhD, big mistake. I think a more adequate route would be to come out into industry where you can learn just as much in a shorter period of time and earn money at the same time, and earn good money at the same time, because your skills are already in demand even with a first degree. But this depends, it's really easy to be glib about this. I think, it depends on you as an individual and so on, but explore all your options. Don't just trip over into the PhD because you like hanging around on campus and you're a bit scared of the real world sometimes, this is an interesting field, and the companies who do AI are quite sophisticated technical environments. They often do their own research. If you're working for Facebook and Google, and you can because they recruit openly, then you'll be doing high-end work from the word go. So
that's good. That's sound advice. I'm sure that was useful to Rayam. It's an old question, isn't it? I don't know. It's always been about, do you keep going and go to academia, or do you need more experience? How do you get experience to try to get a job? And the job market's never been more competitive. So I think all interlinked questions. I've got one here, another one from John. Okay. It's quite a curious one. So he's asking, have we got to the stage that the Turing test has now been passed?
Yeah, well, the Turing test is interesting because it's not so much that the Turing test has been passed, but the Turing test is a bit passé. So the Turing test is defined by Turing, in his in the very famous paper he wrote on the topic. It was phrased in such a way that these days it seems inappropriate. So there are a huge number of variations on the Turing test now anyway. And the very simple definition of does it fool people into thinking it's human? Well, before we came on, I had a chat with somebody, I can't remember who it was, John or somebody, about ELIZA. Now, I studied at Dartmouth College way back in the day when I was a student, and that's an Ivy League college in the States. And they had their first big conference in AI in 1956. And one of the participants in that conference wrote a thing called ELIZA, which was like a chatbot therapist. And his secretary famously thought it was a real person. And it sort of blew his socks off because he put a huge amount of effort. All it did was pick up keywords in the question and throw them back at you, which some would say is exactly what therapists still do today. But the interesting thing was the Turing test in that sense has been passed many, many times, sometimes called weak Turing test and so on. But there are many, many variants on that. And we don't have time to go into that tonight, but I'm not too sure that the Turing test is that relevant these days. It's a bit like the idea of the singularity or AI as an existential threat. You know, Ray Kurzweil wrote The Singularity is Here, that famous book, but most serious people in AI don't actually believe in that thing called the singularity. They don't quite know what it is. When you unpack it logically, it seems like a rather odd concept. And the same has proved to be true philosophically with the Turing test. It turns out that when you unpack it, it's a more complex issue than you imagine.
I've got a few more, but they're quite, I would deem them to be quite chunky and could be interesting sort of little debates sort of at the end. I'm quite keen to keep. Would you want to take one more, or do you want to keep going? Or
go for one more, and then yeah, fair enough.
Okay. So we've got a good one here from Jim. So AI seems to be an unstoppable force. I think we'd all agree with that. What, if anything, could derail that direction?
Well, I don't think much will derail it because it's the natural progression of technology. There may be the one thing that can slow it down is I think overzealous legislation. I've hinted at that in Europe. So if you read the problem with the legislative bodies looking at AI, there's some really good people here. Actually, the EU group is a good one, but there are many others who don't really have the skills to understand the technology, I sometimes feel. So they tend to anthropomorphize it, which is why I gave those disclaimers at the beginning about it just being maths and software. It has no brain, it has no intelligence in the sense of a consciousness or executive control in that sense. So the danger here, derailment can come in Europe politically by being overzealous in regulation and then just squashing the research. You know, I mean, I've lost count of the number of bodies now that are writing reports on AI and ethics, you know, and I read them and they're all dull and quite predictable templated stuff, really. A massive amount of anthropomorphizing about what AI actually is. So I think the derailment would come politically, but that would be spotty because nothing's going to derail it politically in China, for example. I think something catastrophic in the AI front might be a second one, if especially in the area of defense. So we already have, you know, I mean, automatic weapons have been around for a long time. In the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, they had machine guns mounted on things that would use face recognition or object recognition software and would ask you a question and would literally shoot you if you didn't answer the question. That's been there for a long time. But autonomous drones, major political errors caused by AI in the defense field, people would really start to worry about the technology then. So these are the typical things I think would derail it.
No, that's some really good examples of where we might get into trouble. Got a few other good ones. I'm going to keep them till later. I'm going to let you keep going just now.
No problem.
Brilliant. Thanks, Donald.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll use that opportunity to move into the sort of ethical sphere for a moment, because I think there are a number of things that are worth tackling, and I'm sure questions will come up.
There was one on the ethics. We knew there would be one, didn't we? So you have had it. So if you want to talk about the ethics aspect,
yeah, sure, yeah. So
everybody will be pleased to hear it.
I saw that one from Craig. Yeah. Well, I think there are. I mean, the thing about ethics is it splits down into a number of boxes, as it were. So the first big one I discussed there was the existential threat, the sort of Ray Kurzweil singularity. Suddenly AI becomes so superior to us that we become its playthings, like a cat or whatever, you know, or it becomes actually what's far more likely, it would be completely and utterly indifferent to us. You know, it wouldn't be an evil demon, because why would it think evil things anyway? You know, it's just maths. So that's a complicated philosophical issue that's perhaps best put to one side. But if you do want, I'll give you some pointers there. Read Steven Pinker. He thinks it's fundamentally a design problem, you know. It's like we don't have an ethical committee around engineering and the building of bridges because the design engineers sort the problems out, you know. And he thinks that, you know, some very smart people think that it's all exaggerated, this whole existential threat. So that's Pinker. And a more interesting guy is Russell, who wrote the major textbook on AI. And he has written a very good book called Human Compatible that really digs into the subject deep. So I'd point towards his book, Human Compatible. People like Dennett, the philosopher, thinks in the middle ground, really. Don't worry too much. But when we come across, we treat it a bit like drugs or pharmaceuticals in the market. In other words, if you bring AI to the market, you must prove that it does what it says on the tin, that it doesn't have any flaws with that you've not told the client, because that can be dangerous, and so on and so forth. So let's put the existential threat to one side. The second big general one, I suppose, is employment. And again, I'm reasonably relaxed on that one. There was a very interesting report from Oxford in 2013 that said that 47% of all jobs, this is in the US, would be under threat within 2 decades. 47% of jobs in 2 decades. That was 2013. We're now 7 years in, okay? And just before COVID, we had almost full employment in the US. So actually, they used AI as a predictive tool, funnily enough, to write that report. But it turned out to be bogus. The report is just nonsense. And it's so easy to get these predictions wrong because nobody really knows. But that's the first thing. We had pretty much full employment even in UK, but before COVID. So the idea that AI is destroying jobs is a bit of a myth. What it is destroying good jobs. It's not destroying jobs, it's taking roles away within jobs and changing the nature of jobs. So we have many more van drivers now because of Amazon and people working in shops. That's the sort of shift we're seeing here. A second quote that every time I go to a conference, a non-technical conference in AI amongst teachers and so on, you see this quote, and it says that 65% of children entering primary school today will be doing jobs that have yet to exist. I don't know if you've heard that quote. It's completely bogus. It was made up. It's fiction. And the guy, several people have traced it back to its fictional origin, but of course, COVID proved that one wrong. I mean, there was a great tweet I saw that said that COVID is basically about middle-class people sitting at home locked up while working-class people brought them things. I love that quote because actually COVID's proved one thing. The people who actually kept us going were the people who do traditional jobs, the people who collected our rubbish, who brought food to our door, who delivered vans, the doctors, the nurses. My mother was a nurse, my sister was a nurse. So it turns out that actually the good old-fashioned jobs that people have been doing for a couple of 100 years are pretty stable and safe. So the idea that all these jobs are disappearing, I think, it is a bit of a myth. So that's existential employment. The second one is race, which is a really interesting one. And quite often you get an attack that would say that all AI programmers are just a bunch of white kids sitting in a room and all male, and therefore they're skewing all the algorithms, either racially or in terms of gender and so on. Now, on the race thing, we've got Sath sitting here, and believe me, anywhere I go in the IT world, I was in Stanford, you couldn't move for Indian and Chinese kids, believe me. I mean, the idea that if you took a pie chart for people working in technology, that is, a huge chunk would be Chinese, a huge chunk would be from India, Pakistan, and the Indian subcontinent, massive chunk there, and there would be other chunks from the Far East and Southeast Asia, and then there would be a slither of white people, up there somewhere. And so, I mean, just look at the chief executive of Microsoft, Indian, born in India, educated in India. The chief executive of Google, born in India, educated in India. So I think of all the industries in the world that are multicultural, I personally find that IT, they're my people. That's where I've worked amongst those people all my life. I find it to be quite multicultural. And I am just not convinced that, the people who program this stuff, it's very difficult to write a racist algorithm. Actually, you have to go some, like you have to, I don't know what sort of warped mind would want to do that, but I don't think that's the real cause of the problem, really. On gender is a different issue entirely, because we could clearly argue that there are not enough women in IT and so on, and that's a truth. And then there are a number of camps here. There's one camp at one end of the spectrum, people like Jordan Peterson, who would say that that women have a natural disposition to go into different types of jobs that are to do with people, as opposed to males who are highly systematic and tend to go into those higher IT jobs. And I saw a very interesting talk by Baron Cohen, who was Sacha Baron Cohen's brother. He's an expert on autism at Cambridge, I think, or Oxford. And he was saying that, the explanation for this is quite simply that there is a male skew towards systematic thinking that is not entirely cultural, but is a genuine gender and sex difference. And so that if you look at the 5, 6, 7 to 1 ratio in autism, for example, male to female, you will find that there's a far greater disposition towards that type of thinking in the male population, female. So that's one camp. At the other end are the social constructivists who think that all gender and so on, and sex even, is just a social construct. There's some people in that camp. I'm certainly not in the camp, somewhere in between probably. But we certainly can point to one thing on the gender issue. And it's a really important point here, in that the research uncovers the deep root of the problem, which is a problem. And that is at schools. So in schools, And it's not just teachers, it's not really teachers, it's also parents. Girls in schools in the UK and the US, I wouldn't globalize this phenomenon. Interestingly, I was in Moscow last year and they claimed that this wasn't true in the Russian education system. But there are subtle cues in England, especially where I live, towards shoveling girls almost, or pulling them into the art subjects. And you have to make a decision in England between 3 or 4 A levels. You don't do like 6, 7 hires as you do in Scotland. You get funneled either into the arts almost or into STEM subjects. And therefore, that happens in schools essentially, you know, before kids get to college or university or into jobs. So I think that would be the root cause that I would really look at to address that problem. Then the next one is bias. And this is the big one. Sorry, do you want to ask a question?
All right, no, I don't want to. Just before you move on to bias,
yeah,
just to sort of rewind you back a little, you moved on to gender, but Kevin made an interesting point. We're talking about the sort of the racism aspect, and he was asking, are a lot of the racist questions, accusations, not mainly rooted in, you know, the actual data sets, AI sort of, and because those are ultimately being trained, and the data reflects the systemic racism in society. I thought that was quite an interesting point.
No, that's absolutely right. This is a very good question. And if we had time, we could really take a deep dive into that one, because technically the way racism creeps into algorithms is precisely by that route normally, not the algorithms themselves. Remember that data sets, if they're harvested data sets, are harvested from the real world. And the real world has racism, so it will capture it. But the interesting thing about that, and I have the book behind me here, Daniel Kahneman, in his book Fast and Slow, got a Nobel Prize for discovering that every human being in the world is basically racist and sexist. And that's because we have that sort of natural disposition towards finding others, you know, different from us and making judgments upon them. Now, we have about 50 to 100 of those biases, and many of them are sort of innate, some are not, some are cultural and learned. But the interesting thing about this comparison between AI and humans is and also Kahneman very interestingly thought that you couldn't educate that out of people very readily. You know, they were really deeply rooted. So just putting them on a course was almost a waste of time. You know, you have to actually change the process in an organization to really have an effect here. But what was interesting about that whole area here was, you're absolutely right, the data sets themselves, but you can solve that problem. So data, when you work in AI, most of your time is spent cleaning data and dealing with data problems. And so we have a number of people who are looking at fairness criteria in terms of the filtering of data, fairness in the algorithms. You can build fairness into the algorithms themselves. There are ways of solving the problem in the maths, because they're maths and data problems, in a way you cannot solve with human beings. So if Kahneman is right that human beings are devilishly difficult to train in this area, and we can make some inroads there, then perhaps AI will be better than us. Because, you know, when I'm searching for something on YouTube, it doesn't know I'm Scottish, I'm male, it doesn't know what my sexual preference are, it doesn't know any of that stuff, you know. And if you're getting recruited on LinkedIn, you can neutralize and anonymize all the data. So AI sometimes, I think, helps get rid of that intrinsic type of bias. And this comes back to the bias issue again, because remember that AI didn't, we said this before we start, AI has 2,500 years of maths behind it. The first algorithm was written by Euclid in the Elements in 300 BC. And a lot of that maths that's been folded into AI was probability theory, statistics. And remember, the art of statistics is all about eliminating bias, or at least identifying what the error rates are in a data set, or the analysis of that data set. So I think, if anything, the maths, the AI is trying hard to eliminate bias, or at least identify bias when it exists, which is why it gets a bum rap, I think, when it's accused of being almost anthropomorphically. It's not the technology that's biased, it's the people who created it, and we can solve that problem. That would be my view of the bias issue. Bias is always going to be there, but I'd rather, actually, in the future, I would much rather my X-ray, if I felt I had lung cancer, was dealt with by a piece of AI than a human with limited peripheral vision who has a high error rate. And we can do the science, we can do the research to see when one transcends the other. Transparency would be another one, which is interesting. And always people say, well, I'm not going to use this AI unless I know exactly how it works. And that's an interesting challenge. But when you use Google, do you know how Google works? No, you don't, because it's proprietary software. Are you going to stop using Google because you don't know how it works? No, because actually you're never going to know how it works. It was so complicated that hardly any human beings on the planet actually can really truly understand how it works. Or if you're an academic using Google Scholar, are you going to go to the Senate or the board of your university and say, Google Scholar is not transparent, I want it stopped tomorrow? You'd have a small revolt amongst your researchers. So I think the demand for transparency is right to a degree when the algorithms are making social decisions in criminology or in healthcare or the distribution of resources. I think that's fair and right. But the demand for transparency sometimes is a bit sort of odd, because I don't know how my brain works. I don't know how nobody knows how the brain works, but we still trust human beings. So the demand for absolute transparency, I think, is a trifle utopian at times. And then the last one I would say is the loss of humanity. I think there's a feeling that AI may be, like we're losing the plot a little bit, relying too much on technology. I personally think it humanizes technology. I love having my EXA in the room, and I've got one in every room in the house. I like Google Assistant on my Pixel phone. This is an AI phone. It's got AI chips in the damn thing. The photography is unbelievable. I've got a really expensive SLR Canon camera over there. This is all I carry around with me now. The pictures are better. It has Google Assistant on it. I can ask it a question anywhere when I'm out and about. It even voices translates as transcription straight off voice. All of those things are built into this tiny little thing in my pocket. So I don't think I'm losing my humanity. I think it's helping me as a human being enjoy things when I'm out for a walk, taking photographs of fungus or whatever it is I've been doing this week. The voice interface thing, I think, is humanizing, and that speech to text, text to speech through the various assistants that are available. We had the debate about female or male. You can choose what you want. So I think on all of these ethical issues, beware of anthropomorphization, beware of over-regulating because of anthropomorphizing things, and let's take it step by step, being careful, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater and the bath at the same time, which is what I think we sometimes do, with this debate around ethics in AI. That's probably a bit controversial, some of those things I've said. So let's pause there for some questions.
I don't think we had any more. We've had
okay.
Folks sharing links, etc., which is awesome. Thank you all for doing that. That's helpful. I'll save the chat down and share it after with the recording.
There is one good one there that I can address, which is the Harvard implicit.
You spot one, did you?
Yeah, the implicit bias test, which.
Yeah, okay.
This is something I know quite a bit about because I'm heavily involved in training in large global companies. So this all started with Starbucks. I remember there was a racist issue in Starbucks some time ago, and Starbucks made every Starbucks employee do unconscious bias training. And they used the implicit test, which is a rather interesting, quick fire type psychological test. Now, the people who wrote the implicit assessment test, IAT test, even they say don't use it for unconscious bias. It doesn't work. It's not properly validated. But every HR department in the land started delivering unconscious bias courses and diversity courses. This was, I think, a mistake, because there's a really good side to diversity training, and actually it's not got much to do with training. If you really want to get things done in our organization around this, then look at your management processes, your recruitment processes, your appraisal systems. You have to really change those things fundamentally to do the right thing. Just batching hundreds of people through an implicit bias course doesn't really solve the problem at all. And I've written extensively on this. If you're interested in the weaknesses around the implicit bias test, you can find the links on my blog. But when the academics who wrote the test say don't use the test, and you still go ahead and use the test, then you have to worry a little bit around this stuff. There are plenty of other good things you can be doing without resorting to that type of thing.
No, it's good. I saw another one from Brian. Where's it gone? So I think it ties into some of the stuff we touched on earlier. So how can we encourage more women to work in AI?
Well, I think, again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself here, I think this starts in the schoolroom. I think, I think going back into the school system, and it's a structural thing in England because of the A-level system. So you choose so many narrow courses at such a young age that you're almost it's like two roads that diverge when you're 16. And I think that's a real shame. I think I prefer the Scottish system where people take maybe a variety of a mixture of arts and science type things up until the end of their 6th year. I think that's a better system, to be frank, although you have that rather weird wasted 6th year. But I think addressing the issue in schools is important. I think also one of the problems I think also is just stop shoving women into the AI and ethics committees and everything, as if that's the only thing that the females who've got any technical talent can do. I think it'd be much better if we welcomed them and made the atmosphere better. Of course, it can be a bit laddish. There's all that sort of stuff, but I think that's a long haul, this one. I think, to be honest, to be frank, I think in 20 years' time, we'll still have this differential to a degree, but it will narrow somewhat so that people's real talents come through. It was interesting in Russia when I was there in Moscow, and I was talking to people working in AI there, and they were saying that, actually, they don't have that problem in schools. There's many girls taking those high-end maths courses as boys, but and therefore they have a much larger number of women in those technical jobs, but still a differential. So I think the idea that it's going to be 50-50 is probably a bit utopian as well.
Yeah, that's good. No, I think unfortunately, I suspect you might be right, but if we see it reduce,
yeah, exactly,
that would be good. But just on your point there about schools, so to me, I've often taken the view that it's also partly to do with where the inspirations come from, where the role models are. And,
I think that's right.
Getting them to kind of, really play their part in encouraging. So, to the question, how do we encourage? Because I don't know. I don't really think schools do that, unfortunately.
No, I think there's a second issue to do with schools here, which is interesting, which is some countries have already mandated AI as a subject in the maths curriculum already, or across the curriculum, and we haven't. And I think that's a bit of a shit. Well, we may have. I mean, I don't actually, to be fair, I don't know what's happening in Scotland. I just haven't lived there. I just own up. But I think it's quite important that we get, the technology of the age into the curriculum in some fashion, so that we can encourage people to contribute positively to it when they leave school and see it as a possible career on the technical front. You have, as I say, one of the biggest and best AI departments on the planet at Edinburgh, and other good ones in Glasgow, St Andrews, no doubt, and I don't know much about that one in Heriot Watt. So there are opportunities are there if we do this properly. Yeah. I noticed somebody's mentioned GPT-3, which is what I was just going to end on in this last little.
Right. Okay. Do you? I've got a couple of other quick ones.
Yeah, no problem.
You're okay with that, and then I'll let you. We've got about 20 minutes.
Sure.
So I think we're back to the implicit bias test. What would be the outcome of the implicit bias test? Does knowing that you have a bias really change it? Oh, I like that.
Well, no, because one of the problems with the test is it's a speculative test. Now, it claims to uncover something in my unconscious, right? So I don't know what came across HR people that they think they have the skill to probe my unconscious for a start. I mean, if people talk about privacy problems, what the hell are you playing at, HR? You think you're going to put a probe in my unconscious and then accuse me of being racist? Do you have the skills to do that? Of course they don't have the skills. It's all hokum, it's parlor games. Really. They're playing a game, really. But because believe me, nobody knows what goes on in the unconscious. Nobody. Ask. That's why they don't even call it the unconscious in psychology departments now. It's implicit or explicit. The idea of the unconscious now is just the word conscious with the 2 letters UN on the front, really, and that's because we don't actually know what it is. But the idea that something sits there like a little racist module, and if we just give it a poke, we can uncover it, and then we give you corrective treatment. That this deficit idea is accusatory and a bit weird for a lot of people, because actually there are far better ways of doing this that are far more human and have far more effect in organizations. That's why I would avoid implicit bias training, because the test claims to uncover your unconscious. No, it doesn't. It doesn't really. So that would be my view on that one.
Yeah, we've got a couple others, but what I'll do is I'll let you carry on. Okay. We'll have another 5 minutes or so at the end for some wrap-up questions, and I might encourage folk to unmute and speak if they're keen to do so.
Yeah. Well, Greg mentioned GPT-3. I'll move into the last phase here, which is about the future of this stuff, really, where it's going. And some really interesting things are happening, and I'm always amazed that it doesn't get big billing. And the first one is Starlink. So that's the Elon Musk, 4,000 satellites in a grid around the Earth, which would mean when it's successful that we get it's borderline 5G, with no blind spots. Now, I've done a lot of work in Africa. I used to go to Africa every year, and and educational projects. And believe me, it's a sobering experience. And however much we want to talk about technology and learning, if you go into places where there's deep poverty, you come back a changed person. Now, what Starlink promises to do is deliver the internet to everywhere. I mean everywhere. There will be no blind spots because it's basically a sort of daisy chain link of satellites that will get things to you or from you wherever it is. This promises to deliver online learning in a way we've never seen before to every part of the world, philanthropically or however politically we solve this problem. 5G is another one. AI works beautifully as long as if it's streaming or it's online, if there's no latency. So if I'm using a chatbot, let me give you a real example. GPT-3 was mentioned. That's a big regression model that was launched quite recently by OpenAI, an amazing piece of software. It sort of blew people's minds, although it's a bit like a giant sledgehammer, really. It just uses so much processing power, it's beyond belief. Nevertheless, you just ask it a question and it sort of writes an essay as an answer. Now, when GPT-4 and 5 comes out, it will blow the whole essay at university market wide open because every student will be able to write an essay in a style that's suited to them personally. To be honest, that's already happening. Down here in Brighton, there are several companies, essay mills, and we have 2 universities here, and you can look at the annual accounts of those companies and work out how many essays have been produced, and it's frightening. So the university system is already, the human system doesn't work. People are buying essays for $100 left, right, and center. You can buy a master's thesis written by somebody from scratch for less than $1,000. So why would this is happening. But GPT-3 will produce content, answers to questions. I saw a really interesting educational example here, and we're going to be working on this, interestingly, where you can create an avatar of Karl Marx, Freud, let's say, or Plato, and you can actually start asking them questions. And because GPT-3 has access to everything Plato, Karl Marx, and Freud ever said, the whole corpus and all the commentary, it comes back with sensible answers. Imagine that as a teaching tool. How wonderful that would be. But coming back to Starlink, 5G, no latency, all that dialogue, Socratic type teaching, which is what real teaching is, will all come to the fore. And then there's a really interesting thing, looking much further ahead, and I'm talking about really far ahead. And I was absolutely fascinated by the Neuralink press conference, the last one, which I really advise people to look at on YouTube, which is another Elon Musk company, which is looking at invasive techniques in the brain. So this is not science fiction. About 150,000 people have a thing called the Utah array already in their brain, which helps them with the use of their arms and legs if they have a physical disability. So this technology has been around for a while. You have cochlear implants in your ears for deafness and so on. So that has been used already. We know it's tried technology, but it's a bit clunky. So Neuralink is putting fibers into the brain, and these fibers are 5 microns. So that's I think a human hair is about I can't remember, is it 50 microns? But anyway, it's tiny fibers, no bleeding, invasive techniques, and that basically can take data from the brain to whatever you want, your mobile in their case, or out to wherever you want in the cloud. But it not only reads data, it can write data back in again. Now, this is only speculation. At the moment, they're looking to solve problems like physical disabilities, but also, interestingly, the second tier of problems is possibly mental illness, things like depression, autism, ADHD, and so on. Those things that cause an immense amount of suffering on the planet. Now, if there's even a hint at invasive technology solving problems of mental illness, I'm all in. My sister was a psychiatric nurse all of her adult life, and explained well to me the suffering that it creates. So if there's technology that does this, and of course the AI is what interprets the data or sends it. But think about this for a moment. Supposing we can write data back, we learned so much about the brain, we can write things to the brain, because the brain really is just memories in terms of learning, long-term memory. Supposing we can write things to long-term memory. Would you rather spend 10 years trying to learn French and failing, by using Duolingo? Or if somebody said, listen, for $50, I can do it in 2 hours. I think I'd take the $50 option. because it may be, and this is really speculative and quite science fictionist, but it's a pointer to the future. It may be that learning benefits from the invasive techniques where the data is interpreted on the readout and planted in the on the write-in techniques. They already have non-invasive little helmets that are quite widely used now in some classrooms in China. There's a rather worryingly little light on the front of the student's head that tells whether they're concentrating or not. Now that's actually reading brainwaves, and it's incredibly crude. It's a bit like noise. It's really just recording volume, whether the volume's going up and down. But it is slightly diagnostic. It does sort of work in a way. But all that data, of course, the teacher can look at the 30 kids and know who's not paying attention and who is paying attention by the lights on their little helmet things. But believe me, in the Confucian social world of China, parents love this. They don't mind it at all. Of course, in Europe or America, parents would be going apeshit at the privacy issues around that issue. But we're certainly, but let me give you a more prosaic example of how AI can help in schools. In China, some schools don't take the register for their kids. My kids are twin boys. They went to the local high school just up the road and spent 20 minutes every morning while a teacher took their names down on registration. 6 years, 20 minutes every day. In China, many schools do automatically using face recognition as you come in through the school gate. It takes a fraction of a second. Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we do that? 20 minutes a day for every school child in Britain, extra learning. Isn't that a goal worth fighting for? I think it is. The privacy issues are really, and data issues are really easy to solve. So I think looking to the future, Starlink is a near-term thing that will start to work early next year with the big trials. 5G coming along, that will help get rid of latency. Things like GPT-3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 will give us massive advances in neuro-linguistic and natural language processing. And then beyond that, in image recognition, the advances in AI, and we don't know what they're going to be, but there will be, they will surprise us, all point to a future where we can do some marvelous things for good. I often think this is a bit like the god Shiva. Shiva was both a creator and destroyer. And AI can be dangerous if it's in the wrong hands in the military, as we mentioned earlier. But we must also look at the good side, and as educators and people who are interested in the future of children, we should step up to the plate and use it as a force for good. I think it would be a mistake just to constantly chip away at it as if it's nothing but a bunch of biased maths. This is far from the truth. It has a great future in healthcare, not only in the reading of scans, but also in the clinical decision-making process. It has a great future, as I hopefully have tried to show you tonight, in learning. So let's stop there and maybe we'll get some other questions.
Great. Yeah. Sorry, I had to briefly step away, but I think we're all good. There was a few that came in. This one here right at the end, another one from Riam. Which are the parts in robotics machine learning? I don't know what that relates to. I maybe missed something you said.
I'm second guessing the question there, but there's quite an interesting thing in robotics. Isn't always AI. In fact, most robots have nothing to do with AI. And I was they use statistical process techniques and so on. You don't really need AI to do a robot that goes boom, boom, and sprays red across the side of a Volkswagen car door. However, there's lots of robotics that does this stuff. But to go back to my original statement, in the world I live in education, forget robot teachers. It means nothing. There's some interesting things around robots for kids with autism, as companions for older people. There's some stuff there. But for that vast bulk in the middle of teaching and learning, I think it's more like online services, things like Alexa. You don't have to have a humanoid form, to learn. That's I think one of the things that online learning has taught us in many ways.
So I saw another one about well-being. Oh, there we go. So yeah, that's a good one. So obviously very topical, given everything we've all kind of been through. A lot of mental health stuff going around. Any good examples of AI for well-being?
Oh yeah. No, this is something I really like as a topic. I'm sorry I never mentioned this. So the first one that hit the market big time was a thing called Woebot, W-O-E-B-O-T. You can find that, just type it into Google. And it's a well-being chatbot, AI-driven, and it does an interesting thing. It uses CBT therapy, which is a well-known therapeutic technique for people with depression and so on. Now, I actually blogged myself because I did it for 10 or 20 days, can't remember. This was a couple of years ago when it first came out. And it was a really interesting experience. Now, I wasn't suffering from depression, but every morning on Facebook Messenger, it would give me a little message. Have you got a couple of minutes, Donald? And I'd say, if I was in the mood for it, I'd say, yeah. And it would show me a video that it thought I might like and ask me what my mood was like. And then it would track my mood over time just to see if I was having any mental illness problems. And to be honest, even though I wasn't having any mental illness problems, I found it quite interesting. I quite enjoyed the experience. But what they did is then go on, it wasn't really a clinical trial, but they compared a number of students who use Wobot with other forms of therapeutic interventions. And the Wobot thing came out quite well. So I think we're seeing the rise of the sort of counseling, mentoring, therapeutic chatbot that has some way to go here. And my friend's a therapist, and all our stuff was face-to-face, but of course, during COVID, it's all been online during Zoom. And I actually think, when I used to teach maths, I used to do a lot of it over the shoulder of a kid, and they never liked the adult in the room. 16-year-old boys think that, you know, anybody over the age of 18 is an old has-been and you don't want anything to do with them. So, but leaning over the shoulder of a kid is difficult teaching maths. And I found that when I did it, I used to use Skype a lot at a distance. The distance helped. It helped the kid because they didn't have the teacher over their shoulder. They slowed down. I slowed down as a teacher. I would give them a task, wait, then they'd show me. And it was, funnily enough, a richer teaching experience than sitting on the kitchen table and tutoring them, you know? So I think in some ways around this well-being thing, I wouldn't be scared of a future where you have smart technology that helps you as an individual in a meaningful way. If that works, so be it, because it's such a horrible problem, you know?
Yeah. No, I tend to agree with that. So I think so again, you know, for years we've talked about automation, right? So like, you know, automating and making things efficient and trying to do things using tech that, you know, humans are not necessarily good at, you know, or there's high error rates for some reason, trying to kind of make these things more reliable. To me is a good use of tech.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point there. If AI does something better than you as a human being, we'd be fools not to use it. But that's what it does mostly. It doesn't replace you. It just does some things better.
It's complementary.
So as a teacher, I would much rather do the problem solving and diagnose the problem the kid's having in maths than do the basic how to multiply two fractions exposition stuff. You know, if that can be done online, so be it. Let me concentrate on trying to solve any problems the kid has. And the same would be true at university level. Concentrate on critical thinking and all that sort of leading edge stuff. The basic slabbing out 3 lectures a week. Yeah, why would people do that in this day and age?
I've got another one for you, but I'm gonna hold it just now because you triggered a thought for me there. But there was a few others here that I'm going to ask. Right, so Rayham's got another one.
Yeah.
You've got lots of questions for us tonight. That's fab. What do you think about the UK companies' process when they hire data scientists compared with other countries?
Well, to be honest, I don't really know the answer to that because I don't really have much experience for hiring data science in other countries. So,
yeah.
I think it's a bit, because it's so new, the first observation is there are a rush to hire data scientists in organizations. I'm not too sure that's always a wise thing, because you might be better off outsourcing it to people who really know what they're doing. It can be a bit of a sort of a crapshoot, you know. In other words, if you're just hiring that one data scientist, are they likely to know the sort of techniques that you need in your company? That's a bit of a sort of gamble, really. And therefore, I suspect that some of this is best outsourced. But yeah, you're right. It's all over the place at the moment because companies they know they need to use this data stuff. There's a bit of desperation about it. So they hire data scientists, but don't really know what problem is this a solution?
Yeah.
Why? They're not really asking that in a serious enough way before they make they go on the recruitment path. That's the first observation. When they do recruit, they don't know what they want, because if you're in a non-technical company, you don't quite know what this stuff is. How do you make judgments on whether the candidate's good or not?
Just feel like you need one.
This is the problem.
You don't know why. I think Graham agrees with you.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Great stuff. I'm just seeing there's a couple of others here. Any more folks? I've got about a couple of minutes, so happy to relay back maybe one or two others to Donald if you've got any. I was just wait to see if any more come in. So I've always been interested and fascinated by the you talked there about, if we put tech and AI to good use to do things that, we perhaps aren't necessarily good at, or there's high error rates, etc., and that reliability I was talking about. But what about the bits that we are or should be better at on the emotional side, for example, where really, we talk about things like empathy and, could we ever truly get to a point where AI could be sophisticated enough to do that stuff as well as a human being?
Yeah, well, the area of AI that you're talking about there is sometimes called sentiment analysis. In other words,
that's the word. Yep.
And it would apply to either speech, which is converted to text, but by and large, the text that you might use on a social platform within your company. So in Learning Pool, I'm on the board of that company. We use sentiment analysis to look at whether people liked courses or not, or what they felt about something, because you can tell in the social chat whether people are pissed off or not. They tell you quite upfront. So sentiment analysis is quite primitive at the moment in AI. So it can give you polar views. In other words, did people like it or did they not? It tends to be quite binary. But sentiment analysis is moving on. So I blog quite a lot. And sometimes I'm a sort of old, grumpy Scottish guy, right? That's clear. Well, that's what my wife tells me and my kids. I'll tell you a story.
Sorry, you're not alone. You're not alone.
I once attended a session in America about coaching in the workplace, and I was in the audience, and this quite famous business guru asked if anybody didn't have a coach, and I put my hand up. And he says, why not? And I said, well, I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure I need one. He said, well, how do you get feedback? How do you know when you're wrong? And my answer was, I have 2 kids and a wife. They tell me every 5 minutes that I'm wrong. So I've always been a bit suspicious of coaching, mentoring, and counseling in the workplace because of that. But coming back to your sentiment analysis, we're using that in anger already with regard to the internal communications, trying to identify what people don't like. In the Royal Bank of Scotland or NatWest, what do people not like? What do they find difficult? You can do sentiment analysis on the text and find interesting things about that. Going back to my blogging, I sometimes put my blog through the free IBM sentiment analysis thing because it spots out whether I'm being too angry or aggressive or not. So if you do a big bit of writing, so I'm writing a book at the moment, it's actually quite good because it spots things that are a bit accusatory or go a wee bit over the top. So in answer to your question, I think we're early in the foothills of this, but sentiment analysis is starting to get some purchase. It's starting to work, but that's a long haul into the complexity of human feelings, whether they're positive feelings or negative feelings like fear or jealousy or whatever. That's some way to go.
Yeah.
But it's starting to get there.
Okay. And we're going to run out of time, but if you were to predict when we might come close
to the sentiment analysis thing, I think that's
being that sophisticated and being able to replicate a range of those human emotions you've just mentioned.
Yeah, it's all a matter of degree. I think we're already at the stage of it surprising us. I mean, I've been involved in this for real, in real projects, and it constantly surprises me, how good it is in spotting some emotions. But that's a far cry from the subtlety of a parent understanding the emotion, like the kid comes home, and they're sad and they've been bullied or whatever. That type of intuitive emotional response, that's a long way to go because you're relying on visual cues, the emotional side of your brain, which is, that whole Kahneman reptilian side of the brain, which is mostly on, that hidden stuff. That's really difficult to replicate in mathematics and therefore software. So I think that's a long way off to reach anywhere near the level that a human being would, or a parent, or a teacher, or a manager would bring to the individual. On the other hand, let's not pretend that parents, teachers, and managers are these wonderfully utopian people who solve these problems.
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been in the workplace, guys. Let's be honest. Even if you are a manager, most of us are pretty crap at it, and we make horrendous errors. And anybody who's, we all know this. Human beings are fallible.
Right. Well, we've got 5 minutes, so
okay.
I think I'm probably going to wrap it up there with the questions. So thanks to everyone for their participation and contributions tonight. It's been absolutely fab. Just before I kind of close it out, I never mentioned your book. I just forgot. So do you just quickly want to because part of the reason we first started speaking to you is because Donald had cite your book and we thought it was interesting. So I think it's fair just to make folk aware of it.
Yeah, sure. So it's called Artificial Intelligence for Learning. And if anybody wants, then they can email me. I'll put my email address here because I can get you 20% off on the code and free delivery on it. So let me just pop my email address here.
No, I'll save the chat and share it around. Yeah. No, I just thought it only fair because that's how we came to first reach out to you and have a conversation. So we came by your book, thought that's really interesting. AI and its application in learning, that sounds really cool. And
yeah. So yeah, if anybody wants to buy it, it's it is what it is. I mean, everything I've said is in that book and a lot more detail. As I say, I can get you 20. If you go to the publisher's website, I can give you a code that's 20% off, and you get free delivery in the UK or US. So just email me if you want that.
No, brilliant. No, I appreciate that. I'm sure everybody appreciates you sharing that. Just to say, thanks. It's been an absolutely tremendous evening. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's everything I hoped it would be and more. And I feel better now because I missed your session at the conference. So no, just to say thanks. Feel free to unmute and join me in giving Donald a round of applause. I think he's certainly worthy of it and deserved. I thought it was a fabulous session. I think sometimes they can't be much more engaging when there are no slides, etc. And you certainly captivated the audience this evening. So no, thank you for that. And thank you all for joining. Just very, very quickly. Shout outs wise. So this is our second last one of the year. We've got one other session for you in December that will be our last one. It's on the 2nd and it's with Mark Abraham. So we're going to be focusing a little bit on product. So we're going to be looking at, so he's a sort of co-curator at Mind the Product. So he does a lot of stuff in that space. And he's actually going to be hosting a panel discussion for us. So there'll be other sort of product experts there, product owners, etc. So really looking forward to that. It'll be fab. So if that's of interest to you, do join us. We're maybe going to make it a little bit festive as well, with it kind of getting a little bit close to Christmas. So we'll see where we go with that. We're still in the planning phase. And yeah, there's also Agile Scotland. So let's not forget about Agile Scotland. So that's on the 10th and the 11th of December. So, look out for that. If you're interested, there's a lot of fab speakers there as well. Looks like another great event. So, join in there. And yeah, I think that's probably all I've got to wrap up with this evening. Thanks again for joining us. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for your participation and enjoy the rest of your day, wherever you happen to be. And we hope we'll see you again for our final session of the year. Thank you all.
Take care. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hath.